Before going into detail, it was made clear that what happened cannot be separated from its purpose, that it is not an isolated experience, but a message that needs to be heard with an open heart and without defenses. Many people heard that warning and still continued. Others decided to stop right there because they sensed that what was coming would shake up areas they had long kept comfortable. The Spirit showed me that this preparation was not exaggerated, but necessary. Because when something touches deep issues in the heart of a believer, the natural reaction is to justify oneself or shut down. And that is why this testimony is not presented as a spectacular revelation, but as a spiritual responsibility. It warns that not everything that is heard should be consumed without filter, but also that not everything that makes one uncomfortable should be rejected. And that tension is what marks the beginning of this story, because from the start it was clear that this wasn't going to be about an encounter meant to impress, but about an experience that left its mark. Not something that stirred emotions, but something that challenged convictions. And that initial warning was the first indication that what was about to be recounted wasn't going to confirm certainties, but rather question them. Preparing the ground to understand that this testimony doesn't begin with the supernatural. It begins with a decision, the decision to listen honestly to something that can change the way faith is understood. Before what is now stirring so many people occurred, the life of the person who lived this experience was nothing extraordinary. This wasn't someone seeking spiritual visibility, nor a person chasing supernatural experiences. It was an ordinary life marked by routines, responsibilities, and a faith that existed, but wasn't examined in depth. There was occasional prayer, basic biblical knowledge, and a quiet confidence that everything was good. And that is precisely why this testimony is so unsettling. Because it doesn't stem from rebellion or rejection of God, but from the normalcy of faith. The Spirit made me understand that many people would recognize themselves in this part of the story. A faith without major conflicts, without visible crises, and without profound confrontations. A faith that doesn't feel threatened because it hasn't been tested. The person kept going, convinced they were on the right path, without noticing dormant areas, postponed decisions, or spiritual commitments that were never examined. And that's where this testimony begins to disturb. Because it reveals that it isn't always obvious sin that precedes a shake-up. Sometimes it's overconfidence. I saw how there were convictions assumed but not lived, truths known but not obeyed, and a relationship with God that relied more on habit than on daily surrender. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no warning signs or reasons to think that something was about to break. And yet, the Spirit showed me that this apparent calm concealed a spiritual fragility, because when faith is not examined, it becomes vulnerable without realizing it. The person wasn't running from God, but neither was they progressing toward a deeper obedience. And that middle ground is dangerous because it creates the illusion of stability. I saw that this stage is key to understanding why what happened next has such a profound impact. Because this isn't about someone seeking an extreme experience, but about someone who was surprised by a complete disruption of their normal life. And that makes the subsequent message impossible to dismiss easily, since it doesn't stem from fanaticism or a desire for attention, it stems from a life that was abruptly halted. The Spirit showed me that many listeners feel uncomfortable at this point because they recognize their own story, a sincere but unchallenged faith, a correct but shallow path. And this identification is necessary before moving forward, because what is to come cannot be understood without recognizing that the greatest spiritual vulnerability is not always in obvious darkness, but in the light that has never been examined. And this is the perfect prelude to the moment that shatters all normality, and marks an irreversible before and after. The moment that shattered normality did not arrive with spiritual signs or internal warnings. It arrived as many decisive things do, abruptly and unexpectedly. In the middle of an ordinary day, without emotional preparation or time to process. The body began to fail, and the sense of control vanished in seconds. There was no room for elaborate prayers or belated promises. Only a clear awareness that something serious was happening. The Spirit made it clear that this part of the testimony is weighty because it shows how fragile human security is when routine is disrupted. Breathing became difficult. Sounds began to fade, and the perception of the surroundings began to distort. There was no external drama, but there was an internal urgency impossible to ignore. The person understood that they were entering a point of no return, without having planned it. And that awareness produced a different kind of fear. Not just physical fear, but a disquieting clarity. Rapid thoughts crossed the mind. Not about achievements or future plans, but about the true state of the heart before God. The Spirit showed me that in those final moments, there is no negotiating or justifying. Only a clear perception of what one is. And that clarity is uncomfortable. Time ceased to feel linear. The seconds seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously, as if reality were losing its firmness. There was no chaos or panic. There was a profound sobriety. A feeling of being stopped by something greater. And while the body shut down, consciousness remained awake. That is one of the reasons why this testimony is so unsettling, because it doesn't describe a smooth transition, but a total interruption. The Spirit made me understand that this point is key because it shows that no one chooses when they will be confronted with eternity, and that faith that has not been examined in comfort is exposed in crisis. The person was not prepared for that moment because no one ever is humanly, and that is where the illusion of control shatters, the idea that there will always be time to put things in order. In that instant there were no voices or visions yet, only a heavy silence and a feeling of crossing a threshold from which there is no turning back. This testimony stops short of entering the supernatural. Because what happened next cannot be understood without this breaking point. When everything familiar fades away and the inner truth is laid bare, unfiltered. And that is the exact moment when what is shaking the world begins. The moment the body stopped responding, consciousness did not shut down. On the contrary, it became clearer in a way impossible to explain with human words. There was no pain or confusion. There was a profound lucidity accompanied by a silence that weighed more than any sound. The Spirit made me understand that this transition does not feel like a dream or an imagined event. It feels like an awakening to a reality more real than the one before. There was no sensation of physical movement, but rather a perception of separation. As if what you truly are were detaching from what can no longer sustain you. Time ceased to have meaning, and space was perceived not as distance, but as presence. There were no flashy lights or distracting landscapes. There was sobriety, order, and an absolute awareness of being in the presence of something sacred. The person understood that they were outside the natural world, without needing anyone to explain it, because everything was perceived differently. Thoughts were not chaotic. They were clear and direct, and each thought seemed to carry weight. The Spirit showed me that in that state there is no possibility of pretending or hiding intentions. Everything is seen as it is. There were no hurried voices or confusing images. There was a sense of authority that did not oppress, but neither did it allow for carelessness. A presence that did not need to impose itself to be recognized. The person understood that they were not alone and that what was happening was neither random nor chaotic. There was purpose even in the silence. They didn't experience intense emotions of joy or terror. They experienced reverence. A reverence born when the soul recognizes it is in the presence of something infinitely superior. The Spirit made me understand that this point is crucial because it breaks with many popular ideas about the supernatural. Here there is no spectacle or entertainment, only awareness, weight, and truth. The person wasn't greeted with immediate explanations or preemptive comfort. They were greeted with a clarity that is unsettling because it exposes. And in the midst of that state of complete lucidity, it began to be perceived that this was not just a personal experience, but a prelude, a moment of preparation for something that was about to be communicated, something that wasn't said immediately, but that already felt inevitable. And it is precisely this part that leaves so many speechless. Because it shows that the supernatural doesn't always come to stir emotions, but to reveal, not to reassure, but to confront. And what came next wasn't a scene, but a word that would forever change the way this person understood faith, the church, and spiritual preparation. But that moment, the most delicate and the heaviest of the entire testimony, was yet to unfold amidst that absolute sobriety. The presence became unmistakable, and no one needed to announce it, because when Jesus appeared, he didn't do so with spectacle or gentle words. He made himself present with an authority that doesn't oppress, but pierces through. And the first thing he produced wasn't consolation, but an inescapable clarity. There were no emotional reproaches or lengthy speeches. There was direct truth. Jesus didn't speak of the world or of unbelievers, he spoke of the church. And that was the most shocking part, because it made it clear that many are confident, but unprepared. Many are active, but not surrendered. Many speak of faith, but live without deep obedience. Jesus showed that there is a dangerous difference between knowing him and submitting to his lordship, and that this difference is not noticeable in comfortable times, but becomes exposed when trials come. The warning was not general or abstract, it was specific and urgent. Jesus said that there are believers who feel secure because they participate, because they serve, and because they speak correctly, but they never allowed the cross to touch their ego. And that is why they live a faith that cannot withstand obedience when it is difficult. The spirit of Metzer helped me understand that the most powerful aspect of that moment was not the content of the message, but the weight with which it was delivered, because there was no threat, only certainty. Jesus made it clear that a faith based on emotion, habit, or comfort does not endure when real pressure arises. He also showed that many confuse closeness with intimacy and that hearing his name is not the same as living under his authority. It was not about losing salvation as a sudden punishment. It was about a faith that proves insufficient because it was never formed in daily obedience. Jesus showed that the church has learned to soothe consciences, but has forgotten to prepare hearts. And this omission is serious, because when the time comes to decide between comfort and faithfulness, many will not know how to resist. The message was not given to condemn, but to warn. Because there is still time to awaken, to return to the simplicity of the gospel, and to allow the truth to confront us before it is too late. The Spirit showed me that this word is the reason this testimony is stirring so many. Because it offers neither immediate relief nor easy answers. It poses an unavoidable question: am I living a faith that prepares me to remain faithful, or just a faith that makes me feel safe? And that question hung in the air with a weight that cannot be ignored, because when Jesus speaks with such clarity, he does so not to impress, but to save. And those who listen honestly understand that it is not about changing the message, but about returning to the center. Not about doing more, but about truly surrendering. And that revelation marked this person irreversibly, because they could no longer live as before after hearing something so direct, so sober, and so urgent. And although the experience was not yet over, the message had already been delivered, and its echo continued to resonate even before their return. When consciousness returned to the body and life went on, nothing was the same. There was no celebration or emotional relief. There was an inner weight impossible to ignore and an urgency that doesn't fade with time. Because after hearing Jesus with such clarity, one can no longer live the same way. And that is why this testimony is not shared as an impressive experience, but as a necessary warning. It doesn't aim to provoke awe, but to encourage reflection. Now, the question ceases to be, what did this person experience? And becomes, what are you experiencing? Because the message wasn't given for a single case. 2571. They call themselves believers. God isn't looking for a busy church, but a prepared one. Not a faith that soothes consciences, but a faith that builds character. And this warning isn't meant to generate fear, but to offer an opportunity, the opportunity to examine what kind of faith we are building while everything seems normal. Because it is in normality that faithfulness is defined, not in crisis. Many listen to supernatural testimonies hoping for comfort, but this leaves them unsettled because it doesn't speak of what God can do, but of what God expects. Not of blessings, but of obedience, not of emotions, but of surrender. And this approach is uncomfortable because it forces us to look at areas that have remained untouched out of habit. Jesus didn't speak to impress, but to awaken. And those who listen honestly understand that it's not about doing more activities or seeking more intense experiences. It's about returning to the center, to a simple but profound faith, to a daily obedience that doesn't depend on mood or convenience. The Spirit made me understand that this testimony is stirring everyone because it shatters a dangerous illusion, the idea that being close is the same as surrendering, that participating is the same as obeying, and that feeling is the same as being transformed. But when faith isn't tested in real decisions, it becomes fragile. And that fragility is only revealed when there's no room left. That's why this message shouldn't be taken lightly, because it's not for judging others, but for examining oneself. No one is exposed here, except one's own heart. And that's the grace God warns us about before it's too late. He calls before closing doors and confronts before allowing deception to take root. This testimony isn't about changing churches or pointing fingers. It's about examining whether your faith is growing in depth or just in comfort. Are you learning to obey when it's difficult or only when it's easy? Because on the day of testing, faithfulness isn't improvised, what has already been formed is revealed. And this is an urgent invitation not to postpone decisions, not to soften convictions, and not to confuse God's patience with approval. Because loving God is not only believing in Him, but surrendering to Him. And that surrender is lived out in the everyday, in secret, and in what no one applauds. Now stop for a moment and speak to God sincerely. Say to Him, Lord Jesus, examine my heart and show me if there are areas where I have become complacent, if I have confused closeness with obedience, or emotion with transformation. Cleanse me of all superficial faith and form in me a heart willing to obey even when it hurts. Awaken me where I have fallen asleep and align me with your truth. And if this word spoke to you, don't let it pass you by as just another piece of content. Remain attentive and surround yourself with messages that help you live awake and vigilant. If you wish to continue receiving warnings that call for true faithfulness, subscribe and join us. Not out of habit, but out of conviction, because standing firm is not a moment, it is a daily decision that begins today. Yes,